Keanu Reeves drove through the busy streets, his knuckles white from gripping the steering wheel. His rescue dog, Bruno, lay beside him in the passenger seat, panting heavily. Bruno had been suffering from seizures for the past few weeks, but this episode was different. It was more violent, more uncontrollable. The tremors racked his body, and Keanu could see the dog's eyes darting in panic, his body stiffening with each spasm. He needed to get to the vet, now. The clinic wasn't far, but it might as well have been miles. Every second felt like an eternity as he drove. Keanu couldn't help but feel helpless. He had always been the one to take care of things, whether it was his work at the animal shelter or the bond he shared with Bruno. But today, it felt like he was failing. Pulling into the clinic's parking lot, Keanu hurriedly got out of the car, his heart pounding in his chest. He carefully lifted Bruno into his arms, the dog's body limp and trembling. The receptionist at the front desk, a woman in her 40s with sharp features and an even sharper attitude, barely glanced up from her phone as Keanu walked in. "Excuse me," Keanu said, trying to keep his voice steady. "My dog is having a seizure. We need help immediately." The receptionist, Linda, looked up at him, her expression unfazed. She gave a quick glance at Bruno, then up to Keanu, her eyes narrowing. "Well, I don't know what you expect me to do. You can't just walk in here looking like that," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. Keanu's stomach churned, but he refused to let her see his frustration. He was used to being judged by his appearance. With his unkempt hair, worn jacket, and jeans that had seen better days, he probably did look like a homeless man, but he wasn't. He was Keanu Reeves, a man with a purpose and a deep love for animals. "Please, just help my dog," he pleaded, his voice growing more urgent as Bruno's body shook violently in his arms. Linda snorted, not even pretending to hide her disdain. "You think you can afford care for a dog like that? You should try somewhere else." Keanu clenched his fists but kept his voice calm. "I can pay. I just need you to help him." Linda sighed, tapping away on her computer without acknowledging him further. "Fine. Wait your turn," she said dismissively. "You're not the only one here." As Keanu sat in the sterile waiting room, holding Bruno close and whispering soothing words to him, the minutes stretched into what felt like hours. He watched as other patients came and went, all treated with far more care and urgency than he had been. Every time he tried to get someone's attention, he was met with cold indifference or outright disdain. His desperation grew, but there was nothing he could do. Bruno's seizure showed no signs of slowing down, and Keanu felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. Earlier that day, Keanu had been at the Paws of Hope animal shelter, a small but dedicated haven for abandoned and abused animals. He had been working alongside his old friend, Chris, who managed the shelter. Chris had always been the kind of person who wore his heart on his sleeve, and over the years, they had forged a deep bond, one built on their shared love for animals and their mutual desire to make the world a better place. Bruno's story was one of rescue. The dog had been found in the back of a trash truck, barely alive, his abdomen swollen from malnourishment and infection. Keanu had nursed him back to health, and now Bruno was not just a companion but a symbol of the work they did at the shelter. Keanu had grown attached to him in a way that only someone who had saved a life could understand. The shelter was far from perfect. It operated on a shoestring budget, and resources were always in short supply. Keanu and Chris often talked about the need for more funding, more support from the community, and better facilities. But despite the obstacles, they had built something special. It was a place where animals were treated with dignity, where the staff worked tirelessly to make sure that every animal, no matter how broken, had a chance at a better life. As Keanu prepared to leave the shelter that afternoon, Chris had suggested taking Bruno for a walk. "You've been cooped up here all day, man. Go clear your head. Bruno needs it too." It had seemed like a good idea at the time. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the park as Keanu and Bruno walked side by side. Bruno's tail wagged as they strolled, the two of them enjoying a rare moment of peace. Keanu had always cherished these moments with Bruno, the bond they shared growing stronger with each passing day. But everything changed in an instant. As they approached the fountain, a young boy on a skateboard zipped by, laughing as he performed tricks. The noise startled Bruno, and the dog immediately froze, his body tense. Then, without warning, the seizure hit. Keanu's heart stopped as he watched Bruno fall to the ground, his body jerking uncontrollably. "Bruno!" Keanu shouted, dropping to his knees beside the dog. He tried to comfort him, but it was clear the seizure was severe. He fumbled for his phone, dialing Chris's number, but there was no answer. Panic began to rise in his chest. The park was crowded, but no one seemed to notice or care. He needed help, and fast. Keanu's mind raced as he tried to control the chaos unfolding in front of him. Bruno's body convulsed with each spasm, and Keanu could feel his pulse quicken, a sickening sense of helplessness filling him. He cradled the dog in his arms, trying to keep him as still and comfortable as possible, but nothing was helping. The world seemed to blur as the minutes ticked by, and Keanu's fear intensified. A few people nearby glanced at them but quickly turned away, uninterested in what was happening. Keanu had never felt so alone in his life. His hands shook as he tried again to reach Chris, but still, there was no answer. "Please, Chris, pick up," Keanu muttered. But his voice was drowned out by the sound of Bruno's labored breathing. He had no idea how much time had passed. It felt like hours, but he knew the dog couldn't hold on for much longer. He couldn't let him suffer. Just as Keanu was about to break down, a soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "Hey, is he okay?" Looking up, Keanu saw a woman standing there, her small dog by her side. She seemed genuinely concerned, her eyes wide with worry. Keanu's heart lifted slightly, the smallest glimmer of hope breaking through the panic. "I don't know," he replied, his voice shaking. "He's having a seizure, and I can't get through to anyone." The woman immediately moved closer, kneeling down beside them. "I'm a vet tech. I can help. Let me take you to the clinic." Keanu hesitated for only a moment before nodding. He didn't have a choice. His eyes met the woman's, and in that brief moment, something unspoken passed between them, the shared understanding of what it meant to care for a helpless animal in pain. Without wasting another second, the woman hurried to her car and helped Keanu get Bruno into the back seat. As they drove, Keanu could only focus on one thing: getting Bruno the help he so desperately needed. The woman wrapped a blanket around Bruno to keep him warm, and Keanu felt a wave of gratitude flood through him. In the midst of all the chaos, someone cared. And that small act of kindness was enough to keep him going. The car sped through the streets, its engine humming steadily as Keanu sat beside Bruno, gently cradling the dog's trembling body. The stranger, a woman in her 30s with short brown hair and warm brown eyes, kept glancing at them through the rearview mirror. Despite the urgency, she maintained a calm composure, speaking softly to Bruno in a way that seemed to soothe the dog, even in his agitated state. "His body's going through a lot right now," she said quietly. "The seizure's severe, but we'll get him there. Just hang in there." Keanu nodded, barely able to speak. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts: fear, frustration, helplessness, but her steady voice was a small anchor in the storm. He felt an overwhelming gratitude toward this stranger who had done more for Bruno in a few minutes than the clinic staff had in the past hour. As they drove, Keanu watched Bruno's seizure slowly begin to subside, though the dog remained weak and exhausted. Keanu's eyes filled with tears, and he wiped them away quickly, trying to regain his composure. The last thing he wanted was to lose his strength now, when Bruno needed him the most. "We're almost there," the woman said, pulling into the parking lot of the clinic. The exterior was clean but unremarkable, typical for a veterinary office, but Keanu's heart raced. His hands were shaking as he helped the woman lift Bruno out of the car. The stranger's small dog, a fluffy terrier, trotted by her side as she led them toward the clinic's entrance. As they approached the doors, Keanu turned to her, wanting to express his gratitude, but the words caught in his throat. He just couldn't find the right ones. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what I would have done without you." She smiled softly and shook her head. "No need to thank me. We're all just trying to help." Keanu offered her money, pulling out his wallet, but she refused with a gentle wave of her hand. "You don't need to pay. Just take care of him." Her words, simple and kind, resonated deeply with Keanu. In a world that often seemed harsh and indifferent, here was someone who was doing the right thing just because it was the right thing to do. As they entered the clinic, Keanu's hope flickered, but only briefly. He had no idea what to expect inside, and after the dismissive treatment he had already received, he couldn't be certain that Bruno would get the care he deserved. But for now, at least, he wasn't alone. Inside the clinic, the air was sterile, filled with the faint scent of disinfectant. The waiting area was quiet, the hum of fluorescent lights the only sound as Keanu and the stranger walked toward the front desk. The receptionist, Linda, glanced up briefly, her expression as cold and uninterested as before. Keanu's stomach churned. He could already feel the familiar wave of discomfort rise in him. "How can I help you?" Linda asked, her voice distant, not even offering the slightest ounce of warmth. She didn't seem to care about Bruno's condition. Just another face, another problem to deal with, like 1,000 others before. "I need to see a doctor. My dog's had a seizure," Keanu explained, his voice tight with anxiety. "Now." Linda gave a dismissive glance at Bruno, who was still weak and exhausted from the seizure. She didn't flinch or show concern, just typed something on her computer and then looked up at him with her usual sneer. "You're going to have to wait your turn," she said. "You're not the only one here, you know." Keanu clenched his jaw, trying to keep the frustration from spilling over. He looked around the clinic, noticing the stark contrast in how patients were being treated. A well-dressed man had just walked in with a puppy, and within moments, the staff was ushering him to a back room with pleasant smiles and quick attention. Keanu felt his blood boil as he watched them fawn over the man and his dog, all while Bruno was left to suffer. Before Keanu could respond, he noticed something that turned his stomach. A homeless man, ragged and dirty, was sitting on a bench near the door, holding a sick dog in his arms. The man's face was lined with exhaustion, his eyes filled with desperation as he waited for help. But no one came to him. No one even acknowledged his presence. The staff ignored him completely, and Keanu could hear the man's quiet pleas. "Please help my dog. He's sick. I don't have much, but I'll pay you what I can," the homeless man said, his voice trembling with anxiety. Keanu's heart sank. It was a scene all too familiar, and one he had hoped never to witness. The staff simply turned away, ignoring his requests as though he didn't exist. It was clear the clinic had made a decision long before the man had arrived. He wasn't worth their time. It was at that moment that something inside Keanu snapped. He couldn't stand by and let this happen. Not to the man, and certainly not to Bruno. Keanu stepped forward, his voice steady but fierce. "Excuse me," he said, addressing Linda, though his eyes never left the homeless man and his dog. "Why aren't you helping him?" Linda barely looked up from her computer. "We're busy," she said curtly, her tone dismissive. "He'll have to wait like everyone else." Keanu's anger flared. "You're turning him away because of his appearance, aren't you? He's asking for help, and you're ignoring him. Is that how you treat everyone who comes in here?" Linda paused for a moment, but only to give Keanu an incredulous look. "You really want to lecture me about how we run things here?" she snapped. "You think I've got time to deal with every stray that comes through that door?" Keanu clenched his fists at his sides, fighting to control the rage that burned inside him. He was just about to respond when the door to the back room opened, and Dr. Porter, the veterinarian, stepped out. Keanu had seen him before, during one of his earlier visits to the shelter. Dr. Porter had been dismissive even then, treating the animals with clinical detachment, hardly showing any empathy or care. But what Keanu hadn't realized was that this man was the same vet who would be treating Bruno today. As Dr. Porter scanned the room and met Keanu's gaze, his eyes flickered with recognition. "You." Dr. Porter's voice was sharp. "What are you doing here?" Keanu's chest tightened. "I'm here for my dog, Bruno," he said, trying to remain calm despite the storm raging within him. "He's having a seizure, and you need to help him. Now." Dr. Porter seemed to hesitate for a moment, before his eyes narrowed. "I remember you. You're the one who volunteers at that shelter. You think that gives you the right to demand special treatment here?" Keanu's pulse quickened, but he stood his ground. "I don't care who I am," he said, his voice low and steady. "I care about my dog, and I care about that man out there with his sick dog. I'm here to make sure everyone gets treated with respect, no matter their situation." Dr. Porter sneered. "You're wasting your time," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But fine, we'll take a look at your dog." He turned on his heel and walked into the back room, leaving Keanu seething in the waiting area. Keanu's eyes flashed with fury as he watched the clinic's staff turn away from the homeless man once more. He wouldn't let this go. Not today. Not ever again. He would make sure the world knew what was happening inside this clinic, and he would fight until every animal, every person, was treated with the dignity they deserved. Keanu's heart thudded in his chest as he sat in the sterile waiting room, his thoughts swirling. He had done everything he could to help Bruno, taking him to the shelter, rescuing him from the trash truck, nursing him back to health. But now, it felt like his efforts were in vain, as if Bruno's life meant nothing in the eyes of these people. The contrast between how the clinic treated Bruno and the other patients was jarring. The well-dressed man with his puppy had been whisked away immediately into a back room where he and his dog would be treated with kindness and respect. Keanu, on the other hand, had to wait in the sterile, impersonal waiting area, his dog still trembling in his arms, ignored by everyone except for the kind stranger who had helped them earlier. But what was even more painful to Keanu was the treatment of the homeless man. He had seen it all before. The judgment, the dismissal of people like him, people who had fallen through the cracks, people who didn't have the means to fit into society's narrow definitions of success. And now, as he watched the clinic staff do nothing for the man with his sick dog, the familiar feeling of anger bubbled up inside him again. It wasn't just about Bruno. It wasn't just about the homeless man either. It was about a system that valued money and appearance over life, a system that turned away the very people who needed help the most. Keanu's mind drifted back to his work at Paws of Hope, the shelter where he had spent so many years trying to make a difference. He had seen the same things there, too. People abandoning their animals because they couldn't afford proper care, animals suffering in silence while their owners struggled. But at the shelter, there was no judgment. No one was turned away because they couldn't pay. The animals got the care they needed, regardless of their background or their owner's circumstances. He had always prided himself on working in a place where compassion was paramount. But now, as he sat in this clinic, he realized just how rare that kind of compassion truly was. And it wasn't just in veterinary care. It was everywhere. From shelters to clinics to society itself, the world seemed to reward the people who had money and power, while punishing those who were struggling. The thought made his blood boil. The doctor, Dr. Porter, hadn't even seemed to notice the injustice happening right in front of him. He had looked at Keanu as if he were an inconvenience, as if his concerns didn't matter. And Keanu had seen that same attitude before in too many places. People who were supposed to help, whether they were doctors, social workers, or even volunteers, often saw themselves as above the ones they were meant to serve. As Keanu sat there, holding Bruno close, the realization hit him hard. He couldn't let this go. Not this time. He had to make a change. The minutes stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. Keanu could feel his anger growing as the clock ticked, each passing second a reminder of how helpless he felt in that moment. Finally, after what felt like hours, the door to the back room opened, and Dr. Porter emerged. Keanu's eyes immediately locked onto the veterinarian's face. Dr. Porter looked a little less confident now, a little more uncomfortable than before. His dismissive attitude had faltered, replaced by something else, maybe guilt, maybe fear. But Keanu wasn't interested in Dr. Porter's emotions. He was done with waiting, done with being treated like an inconvenience. "Is he okay?" Keanu asked, trying to keep his voice steady, though the anxiety was creeping up in his chest. Dr. Porter hesitated before nodding. "He's stable for now. We gave him some medication to calm the seizures." He paused, eyeing Keanu carefully. "But you should be aware, this is going to be expensive treatment. I'm not sure you can afford the cost." Keanu clenched his jaw. The words hung in the air like a challenge. He knew exactly what Dr. Porter was implying, and it made his blood boil. It wasn't about the cost. It wasn't about whether Keanu could afford the treatment. It was about the assumption that he was somehow less than because of his appearance. Keanu stood up slowly, walking over to the counter where Dr. Porter was standing. His voice was low, but there was a fierce edge to it. "I'm Keanu Reeves," he said, his words heavy with meaning. "You may not know me, but you will. And you will remember this moment." Dr. Porter's face shifted. Recognition flickered in his eyes. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. Keanu wasn't going to let him off the hook. "You think you can treat people like this?" Keanu continued, his anger simmering beneath the surface. "Just because someone looks different or doesn't have money doesn't mean they don't deserve care. You're supposed to be a professional, a doctor. You took an oath to do no harm. And right now, you're doing harm." Dr. Porter opened his mouth to respond, but Keanu wasn't finished. "You're not just treating my dog, Dr. Porter," he said, his voice hardening. "You're treating a whole system, a system that's broken, and I won't stand by and let you or anyone else perpetuate that." The vet's face reddened as Keanu's words sank in. Keanu wasn't done. "If you're a vet who really cares about animals, you'll take a good, hard look at what's going on in this clinic. You'll see how you're turning away people who need help. You'll see how you're failing the animals you promised to protect." Dr. Porter's silence spoke volumes. Keanu didn't need an apology. He didn't need Dr. Porter to explain himself. He knew what was going on, and he wasn't going to let it continue. Before he could say anything else, the homeless man with the sick dog stepped forward, his face lined with gratitude. "Thank you," the man said, his voice rough but full of sincerity. "Thank you for standing up for us. Not everyone would do that." Keanu nodded, his eyes meeting the man's. It wasn't much, but it was something. And something was better than nothing. "I'm going to make sure things change," Keanu said quietly, the weight of his words settling over him. He had no idea how he would do it, but he knew one thing for certain. This fight was just beginning. The clinic was still buzzing with activity as Chris from Paws of Hope arrived, his expression a mix of concern and relief when he saw Bruno. Keanu had called him earlier, asking him to bring the medication Bruno needed. Chris wasted no time. He immediately began assessing Bruno's condition, pulling the necessary medical supplies from his bag. Keanu watched as Chris worked with the precision of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. No hesitation, no indifference, just compassion and care. Keanu felt a wave of relief wash over him as Chris administered the medication, stabilizing Bruno's condition. For the first time in hours, Keanu felt like he could breathe again. But as he watched his friend work, a sense of anger still simmered beneath the surface. Bruno was getting the help he needed, but so many others wouldn't. And that wasn't right. "Thank you, man," Keanu said to Chris, his voice gruff with emotion. Chris smiled at him, though his expression was filled with understanding. "I'm just doing my job. But I know this isn't just about Bruno. It's about all the animals and people who don't have the means to fight for care. You're doing the right thing, Keanu." Keanu nodded, his resolve strengthening. He wasn't going to stop here. He wasn't going to let this fight be something that ended in this clinic. He was going to take it further. He was going to make sure that every animal, every person who needed help would get it. No matter who they were, no matter what they looked like. As he looked at Bruno, lying comfortably now, Keanu knew that this was just the beginning. He had a mission, and he wasn't about to let anyone stand in his way. Chris's presence was like a beacon of hope in the midst of the chaos. The moment he entered the clinic, Keanu felt a wave of relief flood over him, though it was tinged with frustration. Chris, with his steady hands and calm demeanor, immediately assessed Bruno's condition. Without wasting any time, he reached into his medical bag, pulling out the medication Bruno needed, and gently administered it. Keanu watched closely, his heart in his throat as Chris worked. Bruno, who had been trembling and unresponsive, began to show signs of stability as the medication took effect. The constant shaking slowed, and Keanu could finally breathe again. He knelt beside his dog, his hand resting gently on Bruno's fur, whispering soft words of comfort. "Thank you," Keanu murmured to Chris, his voice low and full of gratitude. "You don't know how much this means." Chris didn't respond with any grand speeches or elaborate reassurances. He simply gave Keanu a nod, his eyes filled with understanding. He knew this wasn't just about Bruno. It was about everything Keanu had witnessed today. It was about the systemic issues, the inequality, the lack of compassion. Chris had always shared Keanu's values about animal care, but today, seeing it firsthand in this clinic, he was even more determined to help. As Chris continued to monitor Bruno's progress, Keanu reflected on the shelter he worked at, Paws of Hope. For years, they had done everything they could to help animals, offering a safe place for those in need, regardless of their owner's circumstances. But as the problems became more evident, Keanu knew they couldn't do it alone. He needed to push for change. He needed to be the one to speak up. "Chris," Keanu said after a long pause, his voice filled with quiet determination, "I think it's time we take this further. This clinic, it's a symptom of a much bigger problem. We can't just keep fixing animals. We need to fix the system." Chris met Keanu's gaze, his expression thoughtful. "I agree. It's not just about treating animals. It's about making sure everyone has access to the care they deserve." Keanu's eyes narrowed. "I'll start here. I'll make sure people know what's happening. We need a change." With that, Keanu made a silent vow. He wouldn't let this injustice go unanswered. Not for Bruno, not for the homeless man and his dog, and not for every person and animal that had ever been turned away because they didn't fit society's mold of what mattered. It wasn't long before Keanu put his plan into action. He used his platform to draw attention to the issues at the clinic and, more broadly, within the veterinary care system. He reached out to local media, shared his experience on social media, and even talked about it on interviews with the press. The response was overwhelming. People from all walks of life began to share their own stories of being turned away from clinics, of seeing animals suffer because they couldn't afford treatment. The voices of those who had been ignored finally had a chance to be heard. Keanu was astonished by the outpouring of support, but also by how many others had faced the same injustice. But it wasn't just about raising awareness. Keanu knew that words alone wouldn't change anything. He had to take action. Keanu started meeting with local organizations, veterinary professionals, and lawmakers, pushing for reforms in animal care that would ensure fairness and access for everyone. He called for clinics to adopt a policy of compassion, regardless of financial status or appearance. He fought for shelters to be given more resources so that they could care for animals in need without the fear of being understaffed or underfunded. He also started a petition that gained traction quickly, calling for better regulations in animal health care. He reached out to the community, urging them to get involved, to fight for the animals who couldn't speak for themselves. Through it all, Chris stood by his side, offering support and guidance as they worked together to create change. They started by organizing donation drives for shelters in need, offering low-cost veterinary services for those who couldn't afford traditional care, and providing education on proper animal care to the public. Slowly but surely, their efforts began to make an impact. Keanu knew it was just the beginning, but it felt like a turning point, a small victory that could lead to bigger ones. The situation at the clinic didn't just end with Keanu's confrontation. The spotlight Keanu had placed on the unethical practices had led to significant changes. Dr. Porter, though initially resistant, had eventually come to terms with his role in perpetuating a broken system. He had been forced to attend training on compassion in veterinary care, and, while Keanu wasn't convinced it would be a permanent transformation, it was a start. Linda, the receptionist, had been reprimanded for her treatment of Keanu and the homeless man, and there were discussions about implementing policies to ensure no one was turned away due to their appearance or financial situation. But even with those changes, Keanu knew that the work wasn't done. The system was still flawed, and there were still so many people and animals who needed help. He couldn't stop now. Keanu's heart swelled as he looked at Bruno, who was finally recovering and wagging his tail beside him. Keanu's bond with the dog had only grown stronger over the course of the day, and he was grateful for the companionship Bruno had provided him through the ups and downs of life. But the homeless man, Billy, was still on Keanu's mind. After the ordeal at the clinic, Keanu had made sure Billy had a place to stay at the shelter. He had also helped him find work at Paws of Hope, where Billy's natural empathy for animals shone through. The man who had once been rejected by society was now an important part of the shelter's team. Keanu, with the support of Chris and other allies, was also working on expanding Paws of Hope. They were fundraising to create a second shelter, one that could reach even more animals in need. They were looking into ways to provide low-cost veterinary services, so that people wouldn't have to choose between their pets and their financial stability. As Keanu reflected on everything that had happened, he realized that the journey he had embarked on had only just begun. His fight for compassion and fairness in animal care had sparked a movement, one that would take time, but that was destined to grow. He thought of the animals at the shelter, the ones that would be given a second chance, and he felt a sense of peace. He thought of the people he had helped, like Billy, and how they had found a new purpose. The system had failed them before, but now they were part of something bigger, a movement to create lasting change. With Bruno at his side and a renewed sense of purpose, Keanu knew one thing for certain. The fight for fairness in animal care was just beginning, but he was ready for whatever came next. And no matter how long it took, he would keep pushing forward, for the animals, for the people, and for the world that needed to see kindness and compassion above all else. The fight for compassion and fairness in animal care was never going to be an easy journey. Keanu knew that, even though some initial changes had been made, the road ahead was still long. But in moments like this, watching Bruno happily run around, seeing Billy find a new purpose and a job, and feeling the love shared for those who had no voice, Keanu understood that every effort he made was meaningful. Every step he took, from confronting the injustice at the clinic to pushing for systemic change, was part of a larger journey to rebuild a world where everyone, people and animals alike, had the right to be loved and cared for, regardless of appearance or circumstance. And most importantly, Keanu realized that life wasn't about individual victories. It was about unity, compassion, and the determination to turn an unjust world into a better place. His journey was far from over, and he would keep standing up, fighting for those who couldn't protect themselves, no matter how long the battle lasted. With Bruno by his side and a broader vision for the future, Keanu knew that he would never give up, because every day was an opportunity to do something better, to make the world a little kinder, a little more just. Thank you so much for staying with me through the entire journey of this story. I hope it resonated with you and inspired a sense of compassion and change, just like it did for me while writing it. Your support means the world, and I'm truly grateful for each and every one of you who took the time to listen, watch, and engage. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to stay updated with more content like this. Your likes, comments, and shares help spread these important messages, and I'd love to continue growing this community together. Feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments below. I love hearing from you all. Thanks again for being part of this journey.